All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into a world that's absolutely buzzing with possibilities, and that is the world of cannabinoids. Specifically, we're diving into how they tackle inflammation and their potential role in managing autoimmune diseases.
It's a really hot area of research. And, it's incredible to think that this intricate system, this endocannabinoid system, was humming along inside us this whole time. And we only uncovered it fairly recently, really in the early 90s.
And that's what we're going to unpack today, right?
Exactly.
So first things first, could you give us a little refresher on what cannabinoids actually are? For those tuning in who might need a quick recap.
Sure. So cannabinoids are basically a diverse group of chemical compounds, and they interact with, well, cannabinoid receptors in the body.
Okay, makes sense.
Now, these cannabinoids, they can come from the cannabis plant itself, and those are what we call phytocannabinoids. Or get this, they can actually be produced naturally by our own bodies, and those are endocannabinoids.
Wow, so our bodies are making their own versions of these compounds. That's fascinating. What are some examples of those, like the ones our bodies make?
So two of the big players are anandamide and 2-AG.
Okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah. And they're part of this amazing endocannabinoid system. You can think of it like a vast communication network constantly working to keep everything in balance in our bodies. What scientists call homeostasis.
Right.
It's involved in so many things, like your mood, your memory, how hungry you feel, even how you perceive pain. And of course, super relevant to today's deep dive, it plays a huge role in inflammation and those immune responses.
So it's much more than just feeling relaxed or the stereotypical high people associate with cannabis, right?
Exactly. There's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And we know that these cannabinoids can interact with this endocannabinoid system through these receptors you mentioned, specifically CB1 and CB2, right?
Right.
So can you unpack those a bit for us? What are the main differences between those two?
Absolutely. So CB1 receptors, you mostly find those hanging out in the brain and the nervous system,
Okay.
whereas CB2 receptors are more concentrated in the immune system and in other tissues throughout the body.
So different locations, different roles.
Exactly. Think of them like specialized docking stations, each one tailored for a specific type of cannabinoid.
Okay, I like that analogy. So I'm picturing these receptors as little doorways on our cells. When a cannabinoid comes along and docks at its matching receptor, what happens next? Does the cell just instantly get the message, hey, reduce inflammation?
Well, it's actually way more complex than that. CB1 and CB2 belong to this fascinating family called G-protein-coupled receptors, or GPCRs for short. Now, these receptors are like busy little switchboards inside the cell.
Okay.
They don't just passively receive messages, they translate them into this cascade of events inside the cell.
So it's not just a simple on-off switch. There's a whole chain reaction going on.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Sure.
Walk through that process. What happens when a cannabinoid binds to one of these GPCRs?
Okay, so let's imagine for a second. We've got a cannabinoid, let's say anandamide, and it binds to a CB2 receptor on an immune cell.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Now, this binding, it actually causes the receptor to physically change shape. Scientists call this a conformational change.
So it's like the receptor morphs to accommodate the cannabinoid.
That's a great way to put it. And this shape-shifting, that's what kicks off the whole signal transduction process. On the inside of the cell, this transformed receptor then goes on to interact with a G protein.
A G protein. Okay, we've got another player entering the scene. What do these G proteins do?
Well, G proteins are made up of three subunits. You've got the G alpha, G beta, and G gamma. And they act like messengers, waiting for instructions.
Interesting.
Now, in its inactive state, a G protein is bound to a molecule called GDP. But when a cannabinoid comes along and activates that receptor, it triggers the G protein to swap out that GDP for a molecule called GPP.
So the cannabinoid binding is like a signal flare, and GDP is the fuel that gets this messenger moving.
Exactly. It's like giving the messenger a sudden burst of energy and it becomes activated, ready to go.
So where does this energized messenger run to? What happens next?
Okay, so things get even more dynamic now. The activated G protein actually splits apart. The G alpha subunit, now carrying that GTP energy, heads off in one direction. And the G beta gamma complex goes off in another direction.
Okay.
And each subunit, interacts with different effector molecules within the cell. That sets off a whole chain of events that ultimately lead to the desired effect. In this case, reducing inflammation.
Wow, so the message gets split and amplified. It's like a relay race with multiple runners carrying parts of the instructions.
Precisely. It's a remarkable system. And one of the key pathways affected by this G protein relay is the CAMP-PKA pathway. Now, CAMP stands for cyclic AMP, and it's a crucial second messenger molecule. Think of it like an internal memo circulating within the cell, carrying instructions from the receptor.
Okay, so the G protein is carrying instructions to CAMP, which then carries instructions to something else. It's getting pretty complex.
You got it. And when that G-alpha subunit we talked about interacts with an enzyme called adenyl cyclase, it actually inhibits the production of CAMP-T.
Inhibits, so it's stopping the production.
Exactly. And this decrease in CAMP levels, it has a direct impact on the activity of another enzyme called protein kinase A, or PKA.
PKA. Okay, so we've got this cascade. The cannabinoid binds, the G protein gets activated, CAMP decreases, and PKA activity drops. But how does this actually translate to reducing inflammation? What's PKA's role in all of this?
Great question. So PKA is involved in a whole bunch of cellular processes, and importantly, the production of those inflammatory mediators we keep mentioning. By reducing PKA activity, cannabinoids essentially slam the brakes on the inflammatory response. It's like turning down the volume on a loudspeaker that's blaring out pro-inflammatory signals.
So by influencing this one enzyme, PKA, cannabinoids can potentially dial down the production of a whole bunch of inflammatory signals. That's incredible. But I have a feeling there are other pathways involved as well, right?
Absolutely. There's a lot more to uncover. We'll delve into some of those next. So, before we jump into those other pathways you mentioned, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier, which is the potential for cannabinoids to actually help treat autoimmune diseases.
Right, because those conditions, they're notoriously complex. It's like the immune system goes haywire and starts attacking its own team.
It's true. They're incredibly intricate. But what's fascinating is that cannabinoids, particularly through their interactions with those CB2 receptors we talked about, they seem to have this ability to, well, modulate the immune system and help bring things back into balance.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about suppressing the immune response entirely. It's more like retraining it, right?
Exactly. It's like teaching the immune system to recognize its own team again.
I like that analogy. Can you give us some specific examples of how this might work in different autoimmune diseases? Like, how could this actually play out?
Sure. So let's take multiple sclerosis, or MS, for example. That's an autoimmune disease that specifically targets the central nervous system. What happens is you get this inflammation and damage to the protective covering of nerve fibers.
Right, I've heard of that.
So studies have shown that cannabinoids, specifically THC and CBD, might actually help reduce that inflammation in the brain and spinal cord.
So they're acting as a kind of shield for the nervous system, protecting it from its own immune system.
Exactly. And then you've got something like rheumatoid arthritis, another autoimmune disease. It's characterized by, well, really painful inflammation in the joints.
Right.
And cannabinoids, again, by targeting those CB2 receptors on immune cells within the joints, might be able to reduce that pain and stiffness.
So they're like tiny little firefighters going in and putting out the flames of inflammation.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And there's even research going on right now looking at the potential of cannabinoids for inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis.
Oh, wow. So the potential applications are pretty wide-ranging.
They really are. It seems they might be able to reduce intestinal inflammation and actually promote healing in those conditions.
It sounds almost too good to be true. I'm guessing there's some challenges and considerations when it comes to using cannabinoids for these diseases, right?
Oh, of course. It's not a simple fix. One of the biggest challenges is really wrapping our heads around the complex interplay between the endocannabinoid system and the immune system, especially in the context of all these different autoimmune diseases.
Right, because each condition is so unique.
Exactly. And we still have a lot to learn about how cannabinoids might affect disease progression and those long-term outcomes.
So it's like we have this powerful new tool, but we're still figuring out the instruction manual. And I imagine there are safety concerns to consider too, right?
Absolutely. While cannabinoids generally have a pretty good safety profile, they can interact with other medications.
Right.
And they can have side effects, particularly at higher doses.
So, just like with any other medication, it's really important to take a careful and individualized approach.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about the legal and regulatory hurdles. The legal status of cannabis is all over the map, which makes it difficult to conduct research and for people to access these potential therapies.
It's definitely a rapidly evolving landscape. So we have this amazing potential for treating inflammation and autoimmune diseases with cannabinoids. But there are definitely still some hurdles to overcome. We need to do more research to understand the complexities of the immune system, figure out how to address those safety concerns, and of course, work through those legal and regulatory challenges.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a multifaceted issue.
It really is. So where do we go from here? What's the future of cannabinoid therapeutics?
I think we're at the beginning of something truly remarkable. We're on the verge of a new era in medicine where we can really harness the power of the endocannabinoid system to develop targeted therapies for a whole range of
I think
conditions.
exciting prospect.
It is, but to really get there, we need continued investment in research. We need collaboration across different scientific disciplines, and we need these open and honest discussions about the benefits and risks of cannabinoid therapy.
It's a call to action, isn't it? To embrace this new frontier in medicine with both curiosity and careful consideration.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so let's get back to those molecular details. You mentioned the MAPK pathways earlier. Can you tell us more about those? What are they all about?
Absolutely. So these MAPK pathways are these essential signaling cascades. They're involved in tons of cellular processes like cell growth, differentiation, and you guessed it, inflammation.
Okay, MAPK, another piece of the puzzle. Tell me more.
So when it comes to inflammation, there are three main MAPK pathways we're interested in. You've got ERK, JNK, and P38, and each pathway is like its own unique signaling route. They transmit information from the cell surface all the way to the nucleus, where it can actually influence gene expression.
Wow, so these pathways are like couriers delivering messages straight to the cell's control center.
That's a great analogy. And in the case of inflammation, these messages are basically instructions for building inflammatory proteins.
So when activated, ERK, JNK, and P38 can all contribute to producing those cytokines and chemokines we talked about earlier. Those things that ramp up the inflammatory response?
Exactly. Think of them like construction crews building up an inflammatory fortress.
Okay, I'm with you. So how do cannabinoids interfere with this construction project? How do they stop the fortress from being built?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Cannabinoids can actually step in and modulate these MAPK pathways, essentially dampening their pro-inflammatory effects.
They're like saboteurs sneaking in and disrupting the construction plans.
Exactly. So, for example, activating CB receptors can inhibit the phosphorylation of ERK, which is a crucial step in activating that whole ERK pathway.
So they're taking out a key player in the construction crew.
Precisely. And it doesn't stop there. Cannabinoids can influence the JNK and P38 pathways as well. Studies have shown that they can inhibit both of those pathways, which in turn reduces the production of those inflammatory mediators.
It's like they're disarming the construction tools, making it much harder to build that inflammatory fortress.
Yeah.
It's amazing how cannabinoids can target so many different pathways.
Yeah.
But we've been focusing a lot on CB1 and CB2. Earlier, you mentioned that there are other potential therapeutic targets beyond those two. You mentioned GPR55. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So GPR55 is this fascinating G protein-coupled receptor. It's being investigated as a potential, what we call an orphan cannabinoid receptor, and it seems to be involved in both inflammation and pain, which makes it a very promising target for new therapies.
An orphan receptor. What does that mean?
It means that we haven't definitively figured out what its natural activator is in the body yet, what molecule naturally binds to it and activates it, but research is ongoing. And the more we learn about GPR55, the closer we get to understanding its full therapeutic potential.
So it's like a new player in the cannabinoid game, and we're still learning the rules. What about that other receptor you mentioned, TRPV1?
Right. So TRPV1, that's a fascinating one. It's involved in sensing pain, heat, and inflammation. And it can be activated by a variety of things, including capsaicin, which is what gives chili peppers their heat.
Oh, interesting. So it's like our internal fire alarm sensing those danger signals.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And certain cannabinoids, particularly cannabidiol or CBD, have been shown to interact with TRPV1.
Okay.
Potentially modulating its activity and maybe even offering some relief from pain and inflammation.
I'm seeing a pattern here, cannabinoids interacting with all sorts of receptors, fine-tuning our body's responses. It's fascinating. But we've been talking a lot about those external cannabinoids, the ones we get from plants. What about the endocannabinoids, the ones our bodies naturally produce? We know about anandamide and 2-AG. Could there be others out there that we haven't discovered yet?
That is a great question, and it's something researchers are actively investigating. There's growing evidence that suggests there might be other, yet undiscovered, molecules in our bodies that can interact with these cannabinoid receptors.
So there might be more keys out there, just waiting to unlock those secrets of the endocannabinoid system. What are some of the clues that point to these mystery molecules, these undiscovered endocannabinoids?
Well, researchers have observed certain physiological effects that seem to line up with cannabinoid receptor activation, but we can't fully explain them with just the endocannabinoids we currently know about.
Oh, interesting. So it's like seeing the footprints, but not actually spotting the creature itself. What kinds of effects are we seeing with these potential new endocannabinoids?
They seem to be involved in all sorts of processes, things like modulating pain, regulating blood pressure, even controlling how cells grow and differentiate. And the exciting part is the more we learn about these potential new players in the endocannabinoid system, the more options we have for developing those really targeted therapies.
It's like opening a brand new chapter in the cannabinoid story. And that chapter is full of potential for even more exciting discoveries and therapeutic breakthroughs. Speaking of breakthroughs, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of cannabinoid bias. Can you break that down for us? What does that mean and why is it so important?
Absolutely. We used to think about drugs in a very black and white way. Either they activated a receptor, so they were agonists, or they blocked it, so they were antagonists.
Right, a very simple on-off switch.
Exactly. But it turns out things are much more nuanced than that, especially when we're talking about GPCRs like CB1 and CB2. And this is where the concept of biased agonism comes in.
Okay, so it's not as straightforward as just binding or not binding.
Right. So biased agonism is basically the idea that different molecules, even if they bind to the same receptor, can actually trigger distinct signaling pathways and cellular responses.
So it's like having different keys that could open the same lock, but each key might unlock a different door within the house.
Exactly. It's not just about whether a cannabinoid binds, but also which specific pathways it activates once it's bound. And this realization, well, it's opened up a whole new world of possibilities for drug development.
It sounds like it. So how does this bias play into developing new cannabinoid-based therapies?
Well, by understanding this concept of biased agonism, we can actually design drugs that selectively target those specific signaling pathways, potentially maximizing the therapeutic benefits while minimizing those unwanted side effects.
That's incredible. So it's like tailoring the cannabinoid's message to get a very specific response from the cell, a kind of molecular precision medicine.
Exactly. And that's why all this research into cannabinoid signaling is so crucial. The more we understand about those intricate GPCR activation cascades, the better equipped we are to develop drugs that target those pathways with incredible precision.
It's like having a detailed map of the cellular landscape, guiding us to the most effective routes. But how do we even begin to map something so complex?
That's where structural biology comes in.
Yeah.
By actually visualizing the three-dimensional structures of cannabinoid receptors and how they interact with different molecules, scientists can get a much deeper understanding of how those interactions trigger specific signaling events.
So it's like taking a peek under the hood of the cellular machinery and seeing how all those parts fit together.
Exactly. And how they're affected by different cannabinoids.
What kind of insights are we getting from these structural studies?
We're learning so much. For example, these studies have shown us exactly how different cannabinoids bind to the CB1 receptor. And that's given us clues as to why some cannabinoids are more potent than others and why they might trigger different signaling pathways.
So it's like having a molecular blueprint that helps us crack the code of cannabinoid signaling. And with that knowledge, we can start to design drugs that speak that language more fluently.
Absolutely. And by combining structural biology with other powerful techniques like molecular modeling and computational chemistry, scientists can create these virtual models of cannabinoid receptors. And then they can test how different molecules might interact with them. It's like running experiments in a virtual laboratory, which really speeds up the process of drug discovery and development.
It's amazing how far we've come in understanding these incredibly complex interactions. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? There's still a lot of stigma surrounding cannabis and its derivatives.
That's true. For so long, cannabis has been associated primarily with recreational use and has been clouded by misconceptions and stigma. And this has definitely hindered research and made it difficult for people to access these potentially beneficial cannabinoid therapies.
It's a cultural barrier that we really need to break down. The science is pretty clear at this point. Cannabinoids have huge therapeutic potential. We need to separate the science from the stigma and approach this field with an open mind and a commitment to evidence-based medicine.
I completely agree. We need to foster a more informed and nuanced conversation about cannabis and its derivatives. A conversation that's grounded in scientific evidence and that puts patient well-being first.
Absolutely. The potential benefits are just too significant to be ignored because of these outdated perceptions. It's a call for a paradigm shift, really. We need to move from fear and judgment to curiosity and understanding. And I think that starts with education.
100%. We need to educate ourselves, educate healthcare providers, and educate the public about the science of cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system.
The more we understand, the better equipped we are to make those informed decisions about our health. and to advocate for policies that promote access to these safe and effective therapies. It's about empowering people with knowledge and dispelling those myths.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about embracing the potential of this incredible field of medicine.
It really is a journey of discovery, both on a scientific level and on a societal level. And I'm incredibly excited to see where this journey takes us. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's bring it back to our listeners and recap some of those key takeaways from our deep dive today. Welcome back, everyone. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring this intricate world of cannabinoids and how they can potentially be used to treat inflammation, even these complex autoimmune diseases.
We started with the very basics, talking about the endocannabinoid system, and really dug deep into the nitty-gritty of it all. GPCR activation, those signaling pathways. It gets pretty complex.
It does. It's a lot to take in. But I think we've painted a pretty good picture of just how fascinating this area of research really is. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. So what are some key takeaways you can use in your own understanding of health and well-being?
Well, I think the biggest thing to remember is that your body already has this amazing system in place. This endocannabinoid system, it's working nonstop to keep everything in balance, keep you healthy.
Right, and it's not just about, that feeling of relaxation or the psychoactive effects of cannabis. There's a lot more going on.
Absolutely. It impacts your health on a much deeper level.
And understanding that can help you make better choices about your health, right?
Exactly. So, for example, if you're dealing with chronic pain or inflammation, talking to your doctor about exploring cannabinoid-based therapies could be a good option.
Of course, it's important to remember that cannabinoids aren't a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Everyone's different. Different cannabinoids have different effects. What works for one person might not work for another. It's about finding what works best for you.
Exactly. Personalized medicine.
Yeah, and that's why this research into cannabinoid receptors and the signaling pathways is so crucial. The more we know, the better we can develop those targeted therapies for specific conditions.
It's all about precision, isn't it?
It is. And, as research continues, we're moving past that simplistic idea of cannabinoids as good or bad. We're starting to see just how nuanced they really are. And we're exploring their potential for so many conditions, everything from anxiety and depression to neurodegenerative diseases and even cancer.
It's really a fascinating frontier. It seems like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
We are, but we do have to be realistic, right? There are still challenges, there's still stigma, we need more research, and of course there are the legal and regulatory hurdles to overcome.
It's true, but the potential benefits are just too great to ignore.
I agree. We need to keep pushing for progress, challenge those old ways of thinking, and make sure patients have access to these safe and effective therapies.
It's about education, isn't it? Educating ourselves, educating healthcare providers, and the public, too. We need to understand the science.
Absolutely. It's about shifting the entire conversation, moving away from fear and judgment, and embracing curiosity and understanding.
And that's what we're hoping to do here, spark that curiosity. So our challenge to you, the listener, is to keep digging deeper into this world of cannabinoids. Keep reading, keep researching, talk about it, ask questions. The more we learn about this system, the closer we get to unlocking its full potential for improving our health and well-being.
It's your health. Take charge. Be curious.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and maybe even rediscovered a sense of wonder about the incredible complexities of your own body. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and as always, keep asking those tough questions.